Could you tell us your full name and your responsibility at the AFDB, and then I'll ask you the next question.
Good morning, my name is Gareth Phillips and I'm the Manager of Climate and Environmental Finance at the African Development Bank.
And explain to us about the session that just ended here, and maybe very briefly tell us exactly how important the session was.
So this session has been about the potential for carbon markets to finance the energy transition in Africa. So you know that we need to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and this is expensive, it creates a number of risks and so on, and we need finance to help to make that transition. We have to decommission existing coal plants, leapfrog fossil fuels and gas, and go to renewable energy. Now the carbon markets are an instrument created under the Kyoto Protocol about 20 years ago, and now they've been revamped and rehabilitated, let's say, under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and we've been discussing some of the rules and opportunities to use the carbon markets to finance that transition to renewable energy.
And the thing I picked, the biggest thing I picked is that carbon markets are not the solution to climate change. So what is the solution?
So, well, you're right, they're not the solution, because carbon markets are used to offset emissions in other parts of the world. So sometimes if it's too expensive to offset emissions using your existing technology, corporates or governments may choose to buy emission reductions from somebody else. So effectively, they pay somebody else to make the emission reductions to offset their own emissions. The problem is that doesn't take us to zero emissions. There are still emissions going into the atmosphere, and we need to get to a situation where there are no emissions going into the atmosphere. There's also a situation where corporates just find it easier to offset than to make their own emission reductions. It's more comfortable to get somebody else to do it in Africa so that they can carry on doing what they're doing in the global north. So, you know, really we need to make sure that developed countries make the effort that is required to reduce their emissions and don't wriggle out of their commitments by using the markets. You know, the solution really is that governments need to be stricter on emission targets. They need to put regulations in place. Consumers need to play their part by using more energy efficient equipment, being less consumptive. For example, reducing meat, the amount of meat that you eat has a huge impact on emissions from agriculture. Reducing the amount that you fly has a big impact on emissions from aviation. And repairing machinery means that we don't have to buy more and import more washing machines and so on. Whereas typically, you know, when they're broken, we tend to throw them out because it's too expensive to fix them. So creating environments that encourage consumers to do more is one of the key things. And the Paris Agreement helps to do that because it encourages governments to take these kinds of commitments, and it presents a framework that they can use to report all the things that they've done, to show to other countries how active they have been and encourage other countries to participate.
And who is the police to make sure this is happening?
So well, we don't really need police because it's a voluntary, the Paris Agreement is voluntary. It's a peer pressure process. Of course, these reviews and reports are scrutinized by review panels and so on, and there's feedback and ways to improve those and so on. But it's a peer pressure thing. It's about looking at your neighbors, looking at your trading partners and say, you know, we like what you're doing here, but we'd like you to do more there. We can help you, you can help us.
Is it working?
It is working. It's taking a long time, but these are, you know, there's 196 parties and we have different interests. But I do believe that it's working, and I do believe we will see progress.
And now tell us what is being done to make sure that Africa gets an equal amount in carbon credits just like the other countries.
So there were some special provisions, and we heard about some of those particularly in this panel. For example, least developed countries, they can have easier access to getting emission reductions associated with renewable energy investments, which is quite important because that can mobilize quite a lot of resources. And there are easier or more relaxed targets for African countries compared to developed country targets. So developed countries typically need to peak and move to net zero by 2050, whereas developing countries and least developed countries can do it sometime during the second half of the 21st century. So there are some provisions that are easier for Africa, but we still rely on significant support and help from donor countries to help build capacity and to help finance low carbon technologies.
Let's shift gear a bit for a question or two, and adaptation benefit mechanism. Explain to someone who is trying to push in the village level how adaptation mechanism works.
So adaptation is and we need adaptation because climate change is destroying people's livelihoods. You hear about in the news floods and fires, droughts and so on. And this means typically, and in Africa in particular, agricultural systems are failing. And it means that households get pushed into poverty. And when you're poor, then you have no choice to do anything. You have to just live off the environment. You destroy the forests, the biomass around you because you need it for cooking. You don't have access to energy and so on. So these are the kinds of things that then result in marginalization of communities, youth and so on becoming radicalized, and ultimately people migrating internally and internationally, and those become real problems, and we need to move away from all of those issues. So we need to help people adapt to climate change. The problem is that most adaptation projects, they're very difficult to do, either because they don't come with cash flows, or the people who need to implement them are not bankable. They can't access credit. Women and youth groups, farmers, they don't have any collateral. They can't go to the bank and borrow money to purchase a solar water pumping system, for example, or to transition to climate resilient agriculture. So the adaptation benefit mechanism, it works a little bit like the carbon markets, and we seek to create certified adaptation benefits that we will sell to developed countries, and they would use those to report their contribution towards stated adaptation needs in developing countries. So if I give you a real example, let's say, let's say a government has 30,000 farmers in a particular region who need to transition to climate resilient agriculture by 2030. Otherwise, the climate models tell us that this region is going to become food insecure. So that is a stated adaptation need. The adaptation benefits mechanism would raise money from corporates, consumers and governments who want to help those farmers transition to climate resilient agriculture, and they would pay the costs of that transition, and then they would report in the enhanced transparency framework that they have supported those farmers in that way, that they've contributed $5 million to help 30,000 farmers transition, and that's their contribution towards the adaptation needs in that country.
And I heard at the session on your side talking about about the fund, the setup of the fund, so the African Adaptation Fund. So how is that fund going to work? How is it going to be administered?
So thank you very much for asking. This is really what we're trying to do now, to raise funds for the African Adaptation Benefit Fund. And this fund will sign purchase agreements with project developers to buy adaptation benefits. And when the project developer has a signed contract to sell their adaptation benefits, then they can go to a lending institution and borrow money to implement the project. Then they'll implement the project, we'll get the certified adaptation benefits and we'll pay for them, and we'll return a basket of certified adaptation benefits to the investors in the fund. So in this way we will kickstart the process, we will create demand for adaptation benefits. We'll also use some of the money for technical assistance and capacity building, awareness raising and so on, and to support the operation of the executive committee and its panels. But the key thing is that this will create demand for adaptation benefits, and we will use that to show to donors and corporates how they can use the instrument. And this is exactly what we did with the prototype carbon fund, which was implemented by the World Bank in 2000. They did just the same thing to kickstart the carbon markets. So this is well-tried methodologies.
Thank you so much for your time.
That's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Asante sana.